What if I told you that behind the glittering facades of the mansions of the Gilded Age lay a quiet tragedy that was kept silent? We are used to seeing lavish balls and happy weddings in historical films, but history has forgotten the thousands of women for whom Mendelssohn's Wedding March never played. They were called the humiliating word old maids, and their lives turned into endless service to other families without the right to their own happiness. In a world where a woman's sole purpose was considered to be marriage, the absence of a ring on her finger was a sentence to life imprisonment within the walls of her parents' home. These women wore silk and velvet, but their souls were bound in a tight corset of social expectations and contempt. They were shadows in their own living rooms, invisible figures whose dreams slowly faded under the weight of duty and loneliness. Watch the video to the end to learn the true price, expressed in tears, humiliation, and broken hopes, that women paid for the right to simply be themselves in a man's world. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the luxurious balls of the past? It is commonly believed that the ball season was a time of joy and celebration. But for many girls, it turned into a real scaffold where their fate was decided. Every debutante knew that she had only a couple of seasons to find a suitable match and justify the money invested in her. If no marriage proposals came, the glitter of the chandeliers began to fade, and the glances of those around her became increasingly cold and judgmental. The first season was always full of hope, new dresses, and endless visits, where the girl was put on display like an expensive commodity in a shop window. Parents spent fortunes on dresses from Paris, hoping that these investments would pay off with a successful marriage to a titled groom. The girl had to be perfect, modest but witty, beautiful but not provocative, educated but not too smart. Any mistake, any wrong glance or awkward word could permanently ruin her reputation and close the doors to high society. But a year passed, then another, and if no suitor appeared, the atmosphere in the house changed dramatically. Dresses became more modest, invitations to the main events of the season became rarer, and the whispers behind her back grew louder. Mothers began to look at their daughters with silent reproach, seeing in them not beloved children, but a symbol of their own social failure. Fathers calculated their losses, realizing that they would have to support their daughter for the rest of their lives, which was a heavy blow to the family budget. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think society treated these women fairly, judging them only by whether they had a husband, or was this a harsh necessity of the time? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about what wealth really meant for an unmarried woman? We are used to thinking that living in a wealthy mansion guarantees freedom and carefree living, but for an old maid, it was a golden cage without a key. Legally and financially, she remained a perpetual child, completely dependent on the will of the men in her family. She had no money of her own, even if her father was a millionaire or a railroad magnate. Every coin, every purchase, every trifle had to be approved by her father or, worse, by her brother, who had inherited the fortune. A woman had to ask for money for new gloves, medicine, or postage stamps, accounting for every cent she spent. It was humiliating for an adult to stand with her hand outstretched before a man who might be younger and less intelligent than her. Often, such requests were accompanied by lectures on thriftiness and reminders that she was a burden on the family fortune. Fathers' wills were often drawn up in such a way that the capital remained in the family, that is, passed on to the sons. Daughters were allocated only a modest allowance, which was paid in installments and could be terminated at any time by decision of the guardian. This was supposedly done to protect women from becoming victims of dowry hunters, but in reality it deprived them of any independence. They could not buy a house, go on a trip, or start their own business because they simply did not have access to funds. Even wealthy heiresses who did not marry often found themselves under the complete control of appointed guardians or family lawyers. They were allowed to spend money on charity or church needs, but their personal expenses were strictly controlled. Buying an extra dress or book could cause a family scandal and accusations of extravagance. A woman lived in luxury, ate with silver, and slept on silk, but did not have a dollar in her pocket that she could spend freely. This financial helplessness shaped a character full of submission and fear of life. Women became accustomed to the fact that their well-being depended not on their minds or talents, but on the mood and generosity of their relatives. Do you think such a life of luxury can be called a real life, or was it just an expensive existence? In the next chapter, you will learn how these women paid for their bread by becoming shadows in their own homes. What I am about to show you was considered normal at the time, but today it is shocking. An unmarried woman living in her brother's or sister's house could not simply live and enjoy peace and quiet. She had to work for her keep. The most common and socially acceptable role for her was that of the beloved aunt, who effectively replaced an entire staff of servants. But unlike a governess or nanny, she did not receive a penny for her labor, working for a roof over her head and food. From early morning, her day was filled with small tasks that the lady of the house was too lazy to do herself. She made sure the children were washed and dressed, checked their homework, read to them, and calmed them down when they threw tantrums. She was entrusted with the most tedious tasks: darning endless stockings, sorting laundry, embroidering monograms on napkins. She sat by the window with a needle in her hands for hours until her fingers began to go numb and her eyes watered from the strain. She spent more time in the children's room than their own mother, but she had no right to raise them. She was a convenient buffer between strict parents and mischievous offspring, a lightning rod for family conflicts. The children often loved her, but as they grew older, they adopted their parents' dismissive attitude toward their poor aunt. She saw them grow up, saw them develop their first secrets, but knew that one day they would fly away, leaving her alone in the empty nursery. When someone in the house fell ill, it was the unmarried aunt who became the main caregiver at the sick person's bedside. She changed compresses, kept watch at night, administered medicine, and emptied bedpans, doing the dirtiest work. It was believed that she had no life of her own and no important business, so her time could be used without limit. No one cared about her own sleep or health because her main function was to serve the family. This role was a lifelong drudgery disguised as family idyll. The woman gave all her emotional strength and all the warmth of her unspent maternal instinct to other people's children. In return, she received only polite gratitude and a place at the side table during family celebrations. Like this, if you are also moved by the tragedy of women forced to give their love to those who often did not appreciate it. Guess what happened next to these women's personal space? As her brother's family grew, or as her parents aged and changed their habits, the unmarried daughter's living space was inexorably reduced. If in her youth she had a spacious, bright bedroom overlooking the garden, over the years she was often moved to worse rooms. The best rooms were given over to children, guest rooms, or offices for men, and the aunt was sent where she would not bother anyone. Often her new home was a small room on the top floor where it was stuffy in summer and drafty in winter. Old furniture that was no longer suitable for the formal rooms was brought here. Worn-out armchairs, threadbare carpets, dressers with sticky drawers. This setting eloquently told the woman about her real status in the house. She too had become something like old furniture. Here, among things that had outlived their usefulness, she was to live out her days. In large estates, she could be housed in the wing where the governess or housekeeper lived, blurring the line between family member and servant. She ate at the common table, but went to her room via a side staircase so as not to be seen by important guests. Her room became a cell where the only entertainment was the view from the window onto the backyard or a blank wall. It was a physical displacement of a person to the periphery of life, into a gray zone of invisibility. Her personal belongings, accumulated over the years, often irritated the new owners of the house, who considered them junk. Books, herbarium albums, boxes of handicrafts, all this had to be hidden away so as not to take up extra space. She had no right to change the decor of the house or impose her own rules, even in small matters. She lived as a guest for decades and felt out of place every day. The loneliness in these rooms was palpable, dense, like a dusty curtain on the window. In the evenings, when music played and laughter could be heard downstairs in the living room, she sat alone by the dim light of a lamp. The sounds of someone else's celebration reached her muffled, only emphasizing her isolation from the world of joy and light. In the next chapter, you will learn what cruel words society used to describe these women. How much do you think attitudes towards single women have changed today compared to that era? Victorian and Gilded Age society was obsessed with labels and status. For women who did not marry, there was a whole arsenal of humiliating terms that stuck to them after a certain age. The words spinster or overripe sounded like a diagnosis, a sentence that could not be appealed. They carried a hint of disgust, ridicule, and pity mixed with contempt. In the literature and caricatures of the time, the image of an unmarried woman was grotesque and repulsive. They were depicted as thin, prim, perpetually dissatisfied individuals with sharp noses and pursed lips. They were attributed with a love of gossip, envy, and hatred of everything young and beautiful. This stereotype was so strong that people expected a single woman to have a bad character and be strange. It was believed that a woman who had not experienced marriage and motherhood was an incomplete, inferior version of a human being. The medical community of the time seriously discussed the physical and mental abnormalities that were supposedly inevitable for old maids. Their natural emotions, sadness or irritation, were attributed to female hysteria and dissatisfaction with nature. Any manifestation of character was interpreted as a consequence of her unhappy female fate. At social dinners, the seating arrangement became public torture for such a woman. She was seated at the very end of the table, next to children, governesses, or boring distant relatives. She was not supposed to have an interesting conversation partner because she was of no value on the marriage market. She was a stopgap filling empty seats so that the number of guests at the table would be even. Young girls looked at her as a scarecrow, a living warning of what would happen if they didn't try hard at balls. Mothers whispered to their daughters, "Look, don't be too picky or you'll end up like Aunt Edith." She was a counterexample, a walking lesson used to instill obedience in the younger generation. In her presence, conversations about love fell silent, as if afraid of hurting her feelings or inviting trouble. Even the church, which was supposed to provide comfort, often emphasized the secondary nature of her position. Sermons extolled the role of wife and mother as the only one pleasing to God for a woman. Loneliness was interpreted as a test, but at the same time as a kind of inferiority in the fulfillment of God's plan. All a woman could do was pray and humbly bear her cross without complaining about her fate. Ready to be shocked? There was one way for an unmarried woman to see the world, but the price of that ticket was high. She became a professional companion to wealthy and capricious elderly relatives. It was a role that combined the duties of a maid, nurse, secretary, and psychologist, but without any pay or days off. Often, it was the only opportunity to leave the stifling parental home and change the scenery. Wealthy widows or elderly aunts, going to the spa in Baden-Baden or to Italy for the winter, needed someone to accompany them. Hiring a stranger was expensive and unreliable, but an unmarried niece was ideal. She was one of their own. There was no need to be shy around her, and she did not need to be paid a salary, only her travel expenses. Thus began endless journeys to the best resorts in Europe as a disenfranchised shadow. The duties of a companion were exhausting and required angelic patience. She had to read novels aloud for hours until her voice gave out. She unpacked endless suitcases, kept track of medication schedules, walked dogs, and endured all the whims of her patroness. If the old lady didn't like the view from the hotel window or the taste of the soup, it was, of course, the companion's fault. In public, in the lobbies of grand hotels and on promenades, they looked like a respectable lady with her daughter or niece. But behind the closed doors of the room, real dramas of humiliation and tyranny were played out. Elderly ladies accustomed to power often took out their bad moods and fear of old age on their dependent relatives. The companion had to silently endure insults, smile, and serve tea. She had no time for her own acquaintances or entertainment. While other resort guests danced or strolled under the moonlight, she sat in a stuffy room, arranging pillows and listening to complaints about rheumatism. A bright, eventful life passed her by, which she could only observe through a window or from a safe distance. She was a spectator in the theater of life, forbidden to take the stage. In the next chapter, you will learn how silence in the absence of events drove these women crazy. What do you think is better? traveling as a servant, or sitting at home in confinement? Medical records from that time often mention diagnoses of nervous exhaustion or hysteria in unmarried women from high society. Doctors prescribed rest, dark rooms, and laudanum, not realizing that rest was the very cause of their illness. The real illness of these women was not physical infirmity, but the crushing, ringing emptiness of their existence. People need work, purpose, meaning, but all of this was taken away from them, leaving them alone with themselves. The days dragged on in an endless succession, each one identical to the next. Getting up, breakfast, embroidery, a walk in the garden, lunch, reading, dinner, sleep. And so it went on for years, decades. The lack of events, the lack of challenges for the mind and soul, led to the women beginning to invent illnesses for themselves. Pain became the only event, the only way to feel alive and attract even a drop of attention. They became regular patients of fashionable doctors who listened intently to their complaints of migraines, weakness, and heart palpitations. Treatment became a ritual that filled the emptiness of the day, taking drops on the hour, therapeutic baths, trips to the spa. This gave their lives at least some structure and meaning. I am sick, so I do not live a full life. This was a convenient excuse for themselves and those around them. Depression, which at that time could not be diagnosed or treated, was a constant companion of these captives locked in golden cages. Melancholy, apathy, and loss of interest in life were attributed to capriciousness and bad temper. Women lay in bed for hours, staring at one point, unable to get up and get dressed. Those around them considered this laziness, not seeing behind it the cry for help of a dying soul. Often this inner pain found an outlet in strange, eccentric habits. Some began fanatically collecting porcelain dolls, some talked to cats, and some wrote letters to imaginary recipients. These were attempts to create their own world, where they were in charge, where something was happening. Society laughed at the crazy old women, not understanding the tragic nature of their eccentricities. Drug addiction was a hidden epidemic among high society women. Laudanum, opium tincture, was sold freely and was considered a universal cure for women's nerves. Women took it to fall asleep, to calm down, to forget themselves. They lived in a semi-daze, in a fog that blurred the sharp edges of their joyless reality. Quiet drug addicts in lace bonnets, the terrible secret of many noble families. Among thousands of broken lives, there were rare stories of women who were able to turn their loneliness into freedom. These were, as a rule, heiresses to vast fortunes who had steely characters and managed to defend their right to independence. They consciously refused to marry, not wanting to hand over their capital and their will to their husbands. For them, the status of old maid was not a stigma, but a shield protecting their autonomy. Such women used their money to change the world around them. They became patrons of the arts, founding libraries, hospitals, and universities for women. Instead of babysitting their nephews, they built orphanages and fought for workers' rights. Their energy, not wasted on family life, was directed toward large-scale social projects. They forced society to respect them not for having a husband, but for their deeds and influence. Some of them devoted themselves to art or science, achieving recognition in fields traditionally closed to women. They traveled to the most remote corners of the planet, wrote books, and made discoveries. The absence of a family gave them freedom, allowing them to take risks and live in a way that no married matron could afford. They were black sheep, eccentric millionaires who were whispered about but secretly admired. But even for these strong women, struggle was a daily reality. They had to constantly prove their worth in a man's world, facing condescension and skepticism. They were called men in skirts in an attempt to undermine their femininity, but they forged ahead, paving the way for future generations and showing that a woman's life could be full and vibrant even without a wedding ring. Their homes became salons, centers of cultural life, where the best minds of the era sought to gather. They surrounded themselves with artists, writers, and philosophers, creating an atmosphere of creativity and intellectual inquiry. They were not lonely in the usual sense of the word. Their lives were filled with people and ideas. Old age came to these women earlier than to their married peers. Without children or grandchildren of their own, they lost their connection to the future, remaining only fragments of the past. When their parents, their only protection and support, died, the world of an unmarried woman collapsed completely. She was left alone with aging, illness, and uncertainty, often completely dependent on the mercy of distant relatives. Her status in the house declined even further. From being a useful aunt, she turned into a burdensome old woman who required care and took up space. The younger generation, busy with their own affairs, often perceived her as an annoying nuisance. They might hint that it was time for her to move to a boarding house or a more modest dwelling, freeing up space for the young. The feeling of uselessness became unbearable, poisoning the last years of her life. She saw her sisters and friends grow old, surrounded by the care of their children and grandchildren, and the comparison was not in her favor. She did not have the safety net of love and affection from her descendants that brightens old age. Her consolation remained her memories, often embellished, and old letters that she reread hundreds of times. The past became more real than the present because she had no place in the present. Many of them ended their days in cheap boarding houses for noble ladies, where poverty and despondency reigned. Gathered together, these lonely old women lived out their lives, sharing stories of past greatness with each other. These were sad places, permeated with the smell of mothballs and hopelessness. There they died, quietly and unnoticed, often in complete solitude. The fear of death was mixed with the fear of oblivion. Who would come to her funeral? Who would tend to her grave? These questions tormented them, forcing them to set aside crumbs from their meager allowances in advance for a dignified burial. They wanted to leave with dignity, to save face until the very end, even if few people appreciated them during their lifetime. Physical infirmity made them vulnerable to unscrupulous servants or greedy relatives. Family jewels disappeared. Wills were rewritten. Money vanished. An old, helpless woman could not defend herself and often became a victim of quiet domestic violence. She could be denied medical care, have her food and firewood rationed, as people waited for her imminent death. After the death of an unmarried woman, surprisingly little trace of her remained. Unlike mothers of families, whose portraits hung in galleries and whose names were passed down from generation to generation, old maids disappeared from history almost without a trace. Their rooms were quickly vacated, their belongings given to servants or sold to junk dealers, and their papers mercilessly burned. No one wanted to keep the archives of an aunt who left nothing of significance to the family. The diaries in which they had poured out their hearts for decades were thrown into the fireplace. These were the only witnesses to their true feelings, their secret loves, their pain, and their hopes. Relatives considered these records to be useless junk, or worse, feared finding something indecent or compromising to the family. The fire consumed entire lives, turning them into ashes and smoke. Thus, the inner world of a woman, which she had so carefully guarded, was destroyed. In family albums, their faces often remained nameless. After a generation or two, no one could remember who this sad woman in a strict dress was, standing behind the happy couple. They became unknown ladies, extras at someone else's celebration of life. Their names were erased from gravestones by rain and wind because there was no one to renew them. The jewelry they cherished, like the apple of their eye, was often remade for new brides. Aunt Emma's ring was melted down, the stones set in new settings, erasing the memory of its former owner. The items lost their history, their emotional connection to the person. The material world that surrounded the woman fell apart, as did the memory of her. Historians and biographers long ignored these women, considering their lives uninteresting and uneventful. What can be written about a person who lived in one room for 40 years and only embroidered? But it was precisely in these quiet lives that the truth about the era, about the position of women, about the price of social norms was hidden. Only now, thanks to a feminist perspective and work with archives, are the voices of these women beginning to be heard again. We have come a long way through the corridors of memory, peering into the closed rooms and secret corners of the souls of women whom society called failures. We saw that behind the label of old maid were living, suffering, loving, and strong people. Their lives were full of invisible drama, quiet feats, and fortitude that were not written about in the newspapers. It was the tragedy of an entire generation, sacrificed to the golden idol of propriety. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see in the comments. Whose hidden destinies should we tell about? And be sure to subscribe to our channel so that we can discover forgotten pages of history together.